Lancaster, where he taught for 26 years. Dr. Faulkner runs popular astronomy programs at the Creation Museum inside our Johnson's Observatory. He also speaks and writes on the topic of astronomy and the Bible. You can find his books and DVDs in our bookstore. At this time, please silence all cell phones. And note that emergency exits are located up front, to your right and left, and along the left side of the room. Now, let's give our full attention and a warm welcome to Dr. Danny Faulkner.
Klaatu Barada Nikto. What did you expect? Something like, may the force be with you, or Nanu Nanu? Certainly you didn't expect anything as trite as live long and prosper, did you? Well, it's pretty clear that aliens are very popular. All right, you see them in popular culture quite a bit. Movies are where you find a lot of references to aliens. And so to illustrate that, I want to show you some frames, some pictures from various sci-fi movies and TV shows from over the years. See how many of those you recognize. Ready? Did anyone recognize all of them? A few hands went up. Congratulations, you're sci-fi nerds. A lot of those, some of those came from movies made before I was born, believe it or not. And space aliens, flying saucers, we see them all over the place. In fact, I've even seen an alien flying saucer. I have a photograph to prove it to you. Right there I am, standing in front of it. If you don't believe me, you can go about an hour and a half north of here near Dayton, Ohio, and visit the Air Force Museum. I was just there last weekend, and we took this photograph. And you can see, indeed, there is an alien flying saucer. Okay, how do I know it's an alien flying saucer? Well, first of all, it's shaped like a saucer, right? Got that part out of the way. And this thing actually did fly. Back in the 1950s, they tested this thing. Back then, even today, they're trying all sorts of weird things. The idea back then is they wanted to have a jet aircraft that could take off from the ground straight up and then hopefully go to high altitude and fly even maybe supersonically. And they thought a saucer would be the best way. And you can see the two glass domes there, one for the pilot and one for the co-pilot. What makes it an alien flying saucer? By the way, it did fly. It never did fly more than a few feet off the ground, unfortunately. It didn't work out very well, but it did fly. What makes it an alien flying saucer? Well, this particular model was designed and built by the Canadian Air Force. And when they couldn't make it work, they foisted it off on the U.S. Air Force. And they couldn't make it work, so they just put it in storage and eventually brought it out for display. So there's at least one alien flying saucer out there, folks. Trust me, there really does one exist. Which brings me to a good point. We probably ought to define a few terms before we get very far, because sometimes people use terms in the words of Inigo Montoya. You keep saying that, using that word. I don't think it means what you think it means. Okay, first of all, an ET, that is short for extraterrestrial. That comes from the Latin terrestrial meaning and extra meaning out of the earth. So that is a technical term, by the way. But colloquially, you might say space aliens or LGM. What does LGM stand for? Anybody? Little green men, okay, that's a quasi-technical term, okay? It's been used for quite a while that way. And then another term, not nearly as technical, in fact, it's pretty colloquial, is flying saucer, and this presumably would be a spaceship flown by LGM. Okay, so now as I've just defined flying saucer, this flying saucer I showed you really isn't, because it wasn't flown by LGM unless they spray painted themselves green or something before they took off in it. The next term is technical, UFO. It stands for unidentified flying object. How many of you today have seen UFOs before? Anybody? Raise your hand if you've seen it. A few hands went up. Okay, what's the matter with the rest of you? Are you afraid I'm going to think that you're kind of weird if you do? Okay, well, it'll help to tell you that I have seen many UFOs in my time. Any other hands going up now? How many people have seen UFOs? Not many. Okay, what don't you understand here? Let's go over this. Three parts of this term. First of all, you see something up in the sky. It must be something, so therefore it's an object, right? So we got the O, okay, right? Now, if it's up in the sky and it stays there, it moves around, it obviously must be flying, otherwise it would fall like an anvil, right? So therefore, it's a flying object. Now, if you've seen an object in the sky that isn't falling like an anvil and you don't know what it is, then you have not identified it, have you? So if you've not identified it, it's unidentified, isn't it? So if you've ever seen anything in the sky flying around, or not falling out of the sky, and you didn't know what it was, you have seen a UFO. How many now have seen a UFO? Every hand should be up. If you aren't raising your hand, then you obviously have not been paying attention. All right, very important. Now, that's to be contrasted with an IFO. That is a technical term too, though few people seem to know that term. What is it? It's an identified flying object. You know what? I've seen many UFOs, but I've never walked away from one. And it doesn't mean I've run away either. It means that I have bird dogged that thing to find out what it was. I had one 3 years ago that I saw that buffaloed me for quite a while. I finally figured out what it was. That was the one I had not identified. Finally, I took it out of the UFO file and put it in the IFO file. So that's a technical term. Many people don't talk about it much. Don't you love that flying saucer, folks? I love that flying saucer. All right. I want to just point out a couple of things. Number one, a UFO and a flying saucer are not the same thing. UFOs and flying saucers are not the same thing. And this is one of those moments where people use terms I don't think they know what they mean when they use them, because I hear many people use the term UFO when they clearly are referring to a flying saucer. I think somehow people think if you use the term UFO, it just sounds like they know what they're talking about. But when they use the term UFO to refer to a flying saucer, it tells me they have no clue what they're talking about at that point, because these are precise terms, folks. For instance, there's a show, it's on late night on radio, on the AM dial. I won't tell you the name of the show, but it is heard from coast to coast. All right, last time I saw that, nobody laughed. So at any rate, on this show from time to time when I'm up in the middle of the night listening to it, I hear the host, guests, and many callers into the show that use the term UFO when they clearly mean flying saucer. When they talk about these things flying around and being from some other planet, clearly they're not UFOs. In fact, if you have identified it as a flying saucer, it can't by definition be a UFO, right? If you think it's a flying saucer, you've identified it, haven't you? So our primary goal, I want to emphasize this again, our primary goal whenever you see a UFO is to try to convert it from a UFO, from the UFO file, and put it in the IFO file. I think there are many people, when they see something in the sky, they don't know what it is, they say it must be a flying saucer, and they're done. And that's just being lazy and taking a shortcut to all of this. Now, we at Answers in Genesis and the Creation Museum, we believe in approaching the world in a biblical manner. I hope many of you, or all of you, do the same thing. We should always turn to Scripture for our authority on these things and find answers on these things. And so I'm sure that all of you have read that chapter in the book, in the Bible, that deals with flying saucers and UFOs, haven't you? I always get worried when I ask that question. Oh yeah, I read that just last night. I love that. There is no such chapter in the Bible. All right? Some of you are kind of worried there for a minute, I could tell. There are many things questions that are not directly addressed in Scripture. So what do you do when you encounter a question that isn't directly answered? Well, you study Scripture, you learn about the Lord, about His revelation to us, you develop some principles of things about life, and you can take those general principles and apply them to those things. That's what a wise man does. That's why study of Scripture is important. So we can take scriptural principles, I do believe, and apply it to this situation. I'll do that in just a few moments. Let me set the stage a little bit. You may ask the question, how did this fascination with flying saucers and little green men and all this kind of stuff get started? And most of us trace it back to an incident that happened in June of 1947. No, not the one in New Mexico. I'm talking about one that happened in the state of Washington. There was a man named Kenneth Arnold who was flying a light plane. He was a businessman, and as part of his business, he traveled around, and he would use the plane if he had to travel some distance away. And he left the Tacoma Airport, and I think he was going to Spokane, I'm not sure now. And about an hour later, he's flying past Mount Rainier, and he saw 9 shiny objects moving along. And at the time, he estimated their speed to be quite a bit faster than the speed of light, 1 to 2 times the speed of light, speed of sound, 1 to 2 times the speed of sound. Now, how did he do that? Well, what he did is he could see them moving like this in this field of view, moving like that, let's say left to right, right to left as you're looking at me. And he estimated how far away they were, and from that he estimated that their speed was hypersonic or supersonic, beyond the speed of sound. You say, well, so what? Well, at that point, nobody had flown faster than the speed of sound. It was just a few months later that Chuck Yeager did it in the X-1 for the first time, clearly did it for the first time. But Kenneth Arnold, as a pilot, was pretty savvy. He knew the technology was there. People were talking about breaking the sound barrier. And at the time, he thought he was looking at a squadron of faster than speed of sound aircraft. And of course, the Air Force doesn't, at that point, still the Army Air Corps, they would not tell you, we've got this new plane that flies faster than speed of sound. So they were kind of keeping it hush-hush, he thought, and that was his story. Of course, it turns out that wasn't it. Well, he landed his plane a little later, and he asked to see the director of the airport where he landed, and he reported what he saw. And word got around, other people came by to speak to him, and over the next couple of days, he told his story repeatedly. It started to spread, and newspapers began to pick them up. Now, he described them as flying objects, shining flying objects, and then asked to describe how they flew. He said they moved like saucers skipping on water. What he meant, if you take a flat, round object like a stone, and you throw it with spin like this, and it hits the water, it kind of hovers. It's kind of cool to watch. You've all done this, haven't you? I would suggest you don't use saucers. It's a little cheaper to use stones to do this. And they just sort of skip along and hover, and it's really cool. That's why I like to do it even to this day. So he described them this way, but notice he didn't say flying saucer. He said they're flying objects, and they moved like saucers on skipping on water. Well, a couple of days later, the Chicago Sun newspaper, they took those two words, flying and saucer, and put them together. We think this is the first time they were used. It was coined there in June of 1947. And then we were off the races. Very quickly, hundreds of reports, thousands of reports began to spread across the country and indeed around the world. Now, people had always seen strange objects in the sky, but now it was different. People were now interpreting these things in terms of flying saucers and so forth. And this kind of died down after a few weeks or so, but then a year or so later, it revived again and spread around the world once again, and it died down, and it's been doing that in cycles ever since. When I was growing up in the 60s, there were cycles of this going on. So much anymore, it's not covered by the traditional press. These kind of things now are done on YouTube and social media, but 50 years ago, 60 years or 70 years ago, they were carried in the conventional news publications. So why the rash of UFO reports? Well, I would propose that there are at least three things going on here. One was the power of suggestion. Now, many times we like to think that these blockbuster movies we have that come out, that's the summer they want to come out with these, right? We have these great movies that come out in the summer. At least a lot of people think they're great. And we think that's been going on for a long time. But until the early 1970s, till the mid-1970s, that's not what happened. Turns out summer releases were the worst time. Those are the dogs. Those are the poor pictures that were released in the summers. It was more towards holidays towards the end of the year, Thanksgiving and Christmas and New Year's, where the big releases were. It's still a big release, but the summer was released now. What changed? Well, in 1975, there was a blockbuster movie that played, and it was the first one, and it just made a huge smash on all of this, and it changed our culture forever. Anybody know what movie that was in 75? Some people have said it. No. Star Wars was 77. E.T. was in the 80s. Dun, 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 dun. Jaws. You were thinking flying saucers, weren't you? All right, I fooled you, didn't I? Do I look like Richard Dreyfuss? People tell me that I do. How do you know I'm not Richard Dreyfuss? Just pretending to be Danny Faulkner. That'd be a good acting chore, wouldn't it? All right. Anyway, he stars in this movie, and one of his first big hit, I think, and suddenly it's propelled out there, and people were going back to the theater, and people saw sharks everywhere, all around the world. I understand that summer beach communities saw many of them saw a dip in their attendance that year because people thought they were relatively more safe going to the mountains that summer. The great whites were not as likely to get you there. I say not as likely because, well, there's some strange things. I could understand I was living in South Carolina at the time, up in the Piedmont near the Blue Ridge, and there were reports along the coast of South Carolina, all these sharks sighted, but there were actually the report of a shark spotted in the Reedy River that went through the town there. Now, you probably never heard of it unless you've been there. And the Reedy River, there's not a place I don't think I couldn't walk across it. I could roll my pants up and probably not get my pants wet. And there are a couple of waterfalls and some shoals. And that great white shark that's 30 feet long had to do a lot of swimming through fresh water to get up there, didn't he? It gets even better. There were some lakes up in the mountains that were impounded up there by a dam, and there were reports of sharks in those lakes too. Imagine that. Even the mountains, they had sharks. Obviously, what were people seeing? Well, they were seeing boots, tires, old cars, sticks, buckets, Jimmy Hoffa, all sorts of things in the water. And always we interpret these. I remember when I was a kid, my sister, every time she saw a stick in the water, it was a snake. Snakes here, just sticks, Linda. That's just sticks. Everybody was seeing sharks because it was suggested to them by the movie. By the next year, things had calmed down and people were safe to go back to the beaches again. And you didn't have nearly as many reports next year over great white sharks everywhere. Now, there's another thing that's going on, what we call the plurality of worlds. What does that mean? Well, we live in a world here. And the plurality of worlds means that there are other worlds out there like ours, maybe with beings like us. And for much of human history, that idea was not possible. Why was that? Well, because much of history, people thought we were at the center of the universe. And if we're truly at the center of the universe, then no other world can be there. And so no other world can be like ours, so plurality of worlds was impossible. But 400 years ago, people dramatically shifted. They decided that we weren't the center of everything. We're just one of several planets orbiting around the sun. So you might have beings living on Mars and Jupiter and Venus. They even thought that the moon and even the sun were inhabited at one time. That was the rage in the 19th century, believe it or not. And then people realized, well, if the sun is just a star, maybe these other stars we see at night might have planets orbiting those. And if they do, then maybe there's life on those other planets. And so, again, people were speculating like crazy. Even the great hymn writer, Isaac Watts, anybody know that name? He wrote my favorite hymn writer. He wrote a book on astronomy. Who would know that? 300 years ago, he wrote a book on astronomy. I've read parts of it. And he actually argued for plurality of worlds as well. I think he's wrong, but he argued that point in there. By the way, by the early 19th century, everyone was talking about this all the time. They thought the worlds were everywhere else. And there was even a young man in New York by the name of Joseph Smith. You ever heard of him? He got some peculiar ideas, didn't he? And one of the things he developed was the Book of Mormon and the Mormon Church. And if you study the cosmology of the Mormon Church, it very much buys into the plurality of worlds. Where did he get that idea? Well, it was a very commonly discussed concept at his time. All right, this is also about 1947 was exactly a decade before Sputnik. What was Sputnik? Well, it was the first artificial satellite launched by the Russians in 1957. They launched Sputnik 1, then Sputnik 2. We had a couple of blow-ups on the launch pad. Finally, in early 1958, we got a pathetic little spacecraft to orbit the Earth, and the space race was on. Well, a decade before that, many people who were technologically savvy knew that the conquest of space was about to happen. We had the rockets developed by the Germans, the V-2 in the Second World War, used late in the war. They were the first objects actually launched into space. So in their boost phase, they briefly entered space and then dropped back down again. After the war, we used the V-2s we captured, and some of their scientists, the Russians did too, to develop our missile programs that eventually made it into space. So in 1947, people knew, if they were technologically savvy, they knew that we were soon to enter into space. There would soon be astronauts and cosmonauts. When, nobody knew, but it was going to happen eventually if you lived long enough. Well, suppose there were civilizations on other planets. Perhaps they had already conquered space. And so if we're about to enter space, couldn't they then come and be visiting the Earth? So the time was right to start thinking about these things, all three of these things coming together. You see, people tend to interpret things, they interpret them differently than they did before. They tend to interpret things, the phenomenon they see, in terms of what they know, or at least what they think that they know. If you have no concept of other planets, plural worlds, and extraterrestrials and flying saucers, then you're certainly not going to be thinking that when you see something odd in the sky. But when you do have that worldview, or that possibility, suddenly you're going to interpret things very differently. So what are UFOs? Well, I've been studying this off and on for half a century. I'll go on to it for a while, back off, read up more later on. And my years of discussion and reflection and study, I think that the vast majorities are misidentifications. People see things like weather balloons, planets, odd clouds, rockets sent up. Who knows? All sorts of strange things that people can see in the sky. Many people are not familiar with the sky like I am, and so they can be surprised by things. And so they're misidentifications. Others are downright hoaxes. You know, people play all sorts of tricks. I was punked by a paper lantern, a Japanese lantern in the sky once. I was fooled a couple other times. People have done things back in the 50s or 60s. People would take a hubcap and fling it in the sky and take a photograph. And, oh, if you don't know what a hubcap is, ask your parents, all right? Or your grandparents, all right? So a lot of hoaxes out there. Now that still leaves 1 or 2% of these things which are not explained yet. So does that mean then they must be flying saucers? Well, no, it simply means we haven't figured out what they are yet. You know, they could be flying saucers. I don't think so. But they could be a hoax we've not uncovered yet, or it could be a misidentification of something else. Okay, to answer this question, this big question of what they are and what they aren't, I'm going to take you through a series of questions. I say tough questions. They're really not that tough at all. Some are a little easier than others. Y'all like Marvin the Martian? He's one of my favorites too. Delays. All right. So let's just, for the time being, let's suppose that ETs exist. Even if you don't think that they do, just pretend that they do, just for the sake of argument, okay? All right. Now, the first question is, where did they come from? Well, that's a real easy question. Look at the term ET, extraterrestrial. They must have come from other planets, all right? Be they in the solar system, or be they outside of the solar system. So a big question arises, where did life on those other planets come from? Assuming that there are other beings or other creatures alive on these planets, like we have a lot of animals and plants on the Earth. Maybe they have a bunch of animals and plant-like things there, and then you have creatures that can build spacecraft and go traveling around the universe. All right. Well, where life came from ultimately on those other planets has really two possibilities. One is that they developed naturally. That is, there was nothing living on the planet sometime in the past, and then there was something living, and they began to reproduce and begin to evolve, and eventually they turned into beings capable of building flying saucers or building spaceships or whatever. That's a totally naturalistic explanation. I'm going to just call that evolution as one possibility. No creator necessary involved in this process. Of course, the other possibility is creation. God or gods created these things. That kind of eliminates the possibilities. Either somebody made this life or the life happened by itself. It kind of eliminates those. Let's take a look then at the first possibility, that life on other planets evolved. Now, when people take that approach, they generally assume that life developed spontaneously or naturalistically on the Earth. I've never heard of anybody who believed that life on Earth was created by God, but yet believed life elsewhere in the universe somehow evolved. I guess it's possible someone could think that, but I can't fathom somebody would seriously suggest such a thing. So what I'm saying is that people who believe that life developed elsewhere believe it developed on the Earth as well. So the question is, if you're committed to the belief that life developed naturally on the Earth, no God involved, it's all through an evolutionary process, did life arise elsewhere in the universe? Well, there are two possibilities once again. One is no, but if that's the case, then by definition we are alone in the universe, and that makes the Earth unique. And if the Earth is unique, it makes it exceptionally special. And if it's exceptionally special, then that drags you right back to creation again, doesn't it? Consequently, most people who believe in the natural origin of life and our evolution on this planet are committed to the belief that life also evolved elsewhere. There are very few evolutionists, committed, materialistic, naturalistic evolutionists, who believe that life is unique to the Earth. There are a few, but most evolutionists do not agree with that assessment. They play the odds. They realize, well, the probability must be that it happened to lots of places. Otherwise, we're pretty special in all of this. So if that's the case, then they would argue that life is likely to evolve wherever the conditions are right. And so if you have life that evolved, then probably intelligent life also evolved. Now, wouldn't it happen on every planet? Not every planet where the conditions are good would life necessarily arise, they would say, but many times it would. Nor would you necessarily evolve into a form of life like us that has intelligence and the ability to build things and dream and so forth. After all, it took 3.5 billion years to reach us. On some planets, maybe evolution would stop at cockroaches or clams. And neither cockroaches nor clams, I don't think they can make flying saucers. One reason is they lack opposable thumbs, which makes it kind of difficult to manipulate tools, but there are a few other reasons why. I think you would agree. Now, I'll give you a few examples of how this thinking drives science. There's this thing called SETI, S-E-T-I. Anybody know what it stands for? Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. It's supposing that intelligent life exists on this planet. I think the jury may still be out on that one, but we'll let that go for the time being. So you're looking for intelligent beings elsewhere, and the way they do this is a guy named Frank Drake started this back in 1960. He said, look, we've been broadcasting then for about 40, 50 years, all sorts of radio broadcasts, and this stuff leaks out from the Earth. So if somebody had a very large radio dish pointed back towards the sun, they wouldn't see the Earth, but they'd still pick up radio transmissions. And if they had a very fine tuner, they could actually pick up on radio and television broadcasts coming from the Earth. Okay, now we know there's no intelligent life on the Earth, right? If you listen to much radio or watch much TV, right? Okay, we'll let that go anyway. Now we can turn the process around. If another civilization exists out there and they've already conquered space, it's inconceivable, another allusion to a famous movie, it's inconceivable that they could have done that without inventing radio first, right? Radio would have to be there. So we can turn this around. We can turn these very sensitive radio dishes out there and tune very carefully and look for radio emissions. Frank Drake did the first experiment into this in 1960. It's come a long way since then. There are now 2 full-time programs going on where they actually try to monitor other signals coming from space. The rage 20 years ago was download this stuff on your desktop or laptop, so when you weren't between looking at cat videos and playing solitaire, you got a lot of CPU that's not being used, and in the background this thing can search through all this data, and by the way, terabytes of data have been collected. Huge amount of data. They've got a lot of data looking at very many stars out there looking for intelligent signals. How many intelligent signals have they found so far? 0. So consequently, you have to conclude that SETI is indicating we're alone in the universe. Now, we sent various Mars probes to Mars over the last 53 years. Now, don't get me wrong, I love Mars. I think it's a cool planet. It's got some neat geology on it. It's incredible what we have there. And I like going back more with robotic spacecraft to learn more and more about it. Got the rovers, got the orbiters, all sorts of cool stuff. But I could do without the boilerplate they have all the time. The boilerplate they put in there. Why do we go to Mars? Well, they spend a lot of time talking about searching for life on Mars. Maybe it once existed there. It can tell us where life came from on the Earth. Well, it's nonsense, because how much evidence have we found of life on Mars? 0. There are better reasons to go to Mars. I think the data are in. There's no life on Mars. There probably never has been any life on Mars. Okay, another thing, they try looking for liquid water. Would you agree that liquid water is essential for life? Yeah, 75–80% of your body is water, and that's pretty true across the board with living things. Water is an incredible thing. I could do a whole talk just on water and how important it is for life. It's inconceivable that you could have life without liquid water. Did you also know that water is the most abundant, H2O is the most, perhaps the most abundant molecule in the universe? We see it all over the place in astronomy. But guess what? Everywhere we've actually seen water, detected water, it's always in the form of gas or solid. We've never actually observed liquid water anywhere else in the universe. Only on the Earth, and it's in abundance. There are a couple of satellites of the outer planets where they suggest there might be liquid water below the surface. indirect evidence at best. There may or may not be liquid water. I'm pretty certain there's no life down there, even if there is liquid water. So how much liquid water we found? 0 out there. Okay, what about the search for extrasolar planets? These are planets orbiting other stars. I mentioned before about the plurality of worlds. That was mere speculation until about 25 years ago, when the first unequivocal discovery of stars orbiting, planets orbiting other stars came in. And the data have come a long way since then. They have found about 4,000 planets orbiting other stars. 4,000. That's a lot. The gold standard is to look for Earth-like planets. How many Earth-like planets have they found? 0. Every year or so they have an announcement, maybe once or twice a year, an announcement of an possible Earth-like planet, but it takes about 5 to 10 minutes on the internet to prove that no, they're not. They're not, or there's something wrong with each one of them. And then finally we come to this thing called astrobiology. Astrobiology is defined to be the study of life elsewhere in the universe. There are 2 actually professional journals. One's called Journal of Biology, I think, and the other one's called simply Astrobiology. One's a quarterly, one's comes out every other month, 6 issues a year. They've been publishing for 15 or 20 years now. There are, you can now get a college degree, a master's, and even a PhD in astrobiology in several universities. It's usually a joint program between the biology and the astronomy departments. And they're astrobiologists, professional astrobiologists. There are conferences every year. I'm a member of the American Astronomical Society. It's a professional society for astronomers, and sometimes at our meetings, I go, well, not all the time, but often enough, to our semi-annual meetings. And oftentimes when I go, there are sections, sometimes multiple sections on astrobiology. I can't help myself. I have to go to them. They're a hoot to go to. And you look at the papers they're generating and all this kind of stuff, and they have all these articles about life on other planets. Let me ask you, how much evidence do we have for life on other planets? 0. See a trend here? Apparently, astrobiology is the one science for which there is no data. And they think we creationists are strange. All right? I'm just saying. All right. Let's look at the other possibility. Did God create ETs? Already, this is not a scientific question now, is it? It's a theological question, isn't it? It's a theological question. And I would draw, remember I talked about those general principles we draw about the world? I'm going to draw a couple of general principles for you. First of all, I noticed that God's attention appears to be centered on man. That doesn't mean that the earth is the absolute center of everything. Doesn't have to be. But it is, being the abode of man and the special place God made for us, it is the center of God's attention. And if it's geographically there, it doesn't matter. God knows where we are, and that's all that matters. Now, a question arises, if ETs, when you say the word ET, you're talking about beings like us. Maybe they don't have opposable thumbs exactly like ours. Maybe they don't have 10 digits on our hands and 10 digits somewhere else. I don't know. Maybe they're shaped differently. Maybe they're not green. Who knows what they look like? But if they're going to be like us in every respect, that involves things like will and emotions and intellect and all this kind of stuff. And if that's the case, then the question arises, they're really like us. Do they have souls like we have? Do they have souls like us? If they don't, then they really aren't like us at all, are they? They're very, very different if that's the case. So if they're truly like us, they better have souls. And if they have souls, are they in need of salvation? Do their souls need to be redeemed because of sin? If so, then why? There's several possibilities. Was it for Adam's sin? Was it for Adam's sin? Well, that's a possibility. That means then that Jesus came on to redeem for that sin. But keep in mind, to the aliens, we're the aliens. Earth is an alien world. So if you were living on one of these other planets and you wanted to share the gospel with people, wouldn't your gospel message start out something like this? A long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away. I think you see the folly of that. Enough said. All right? Okay, if it's not for Adam's sin, could it be for sin introduced on the other planets? That is, maybe on each planet there was an Adam-like creature and an Eve-like creature, and each one of them individually sinned. So you've got not just Adam's race, but Zardok's race and Zuzov's race, all these different creatures on other different planets. But then wouldn't that require redemption for each one of those worlds. So when Jesus he came to this earth, he was born a virgin, lived a perfect life, taught, and then he was laid down his life for an atonement for sins, rose from the dead in victory over death and sin, ascended up to heaven to go to another planet to do it again and again and again and again. Well, if you know the New Testament very well at all, you know when Jesus left this world, he did not go to another world. Where did he go? He went to heaven to sit at the right hand of the Father. Other places he said, I go to prepare a place for you. I mean, it's very clear Jesus left this world and went to heaven to be with the Father and prepare for us. So I think quite literally, Jesus died once for all. Okay, so if it wasn't for Adam's sin, and if it's not for their own sin on their own planets, then the only other possibility is maybe they never fell into sin. Maybe they were always stayed in a sinless state, unlike Adam's race. The problem with that, I think, is the fact that Romans 8 describes the whole creation groaning under that bondage of sin. It's under that taint of man's sin. All of creation, by the way, that's the reason why I believe, according to Isaiah, 2 Peter, and also the book of Revelation, there will be a new heavens and a new earth. The entire creation must be redeemed as well. So you have these creatures who are sinless, who are living in a sin-tainted world, and that raises all sorts of theological and logical problems, I think. So I don't think that's a possibility either. Conclusion? I don't think from a biblical worldview, I can't give you chapter and verse to say God didn't make ETs, but I think these general principles indicate that yes, we are alone in the universe. Now, let me take a little interlude here. I mentioned Frank Drake, the guy who in 1960 wanted to start SETI. He started the first SETI program. The following year, in 1961, he decided, well, we need to kind of quantify this. If I'm going to start looking for alien worlds, I need to get a handle on how many alien worlds there might be out there. So he came up with this Drake equation. You didn't know there was going to be some math today, right? I'm sorry, I apologize, but we'll make it just as simple as possible. Notice the Drake equation starts off with n on the left side, and it's equal to the product of 7 numbers. Okay, n is equal to the product of 7 numbers. So what are those numbers? Okay, first of all, n on the left side was the number of civilizations in our galaxy which communication might be possible. Now, the Drake equation, he had formulated it in the sense of communication, just picking up radio signals. But we can generalize this to how many civilizations might be out there flying around in space, like us. The probability of them coming here to visit. The same sort of proposition. So it's equal to 7 things. The first term on the right is the average number of stars formed per year in the galaxy. The second term is F sub p, the fraction of stars that have planets. Notice that unlike R, this is indeed a fraction. It's between 0 and 1. It could be 0 or it could be 1 or anywhere in between. The next one is N sub e, is the average number of planets per star that could support life. I wrote it as a number. I suspect this is a fraction too. It's between 0 and 1, but I can't prove that. Next point, F sub L is the fraction of planets that could support life on which life actually develops. So you got an advantageous Earth-like planet, but life doesn't develop sometimes. Well, what fraction do and which fraction don't? That's the fraction, again, between 0 and 1. And then just because you get life, it doesn't mean that intelligent life will necessarily develop. We're back to cockroaches and clams again, aren't we? So that's a fraction between 0 and 1. And then F sub c is a fraction of civilizations that develop technology like radio or space travel that we could actually detect, or they could come visit us, modifying that ever so slightly there. After all, a world could just, with people like creatures on it, could be stuck in the Middle Ages or in ancient times. It may never get past the catapult or the bows and arrows or something. And then finally, we have L, the length of time over which such civilizations release detectable radio signals or exist so that they can build spacecraft and travel around. You see, back in the 60s, they were worried about the Cold War blowing up the planet. Today, we're worried about climate destruction and everything else. We're always worried in our hubris about how we might destroy the Earth. And the point is, there's a finite lifetime on these civilizations, it's generally believed. It could be 10,000 years, could be 1,000 years, could be 1,000,000, who knows, but there's a finite lifetime. So you multiply these 7 terms together, and that gives you your answer of how many civilizations there are. So let's talk about the evaluation of these 7 terms. Now, let me ask you this. How many of the 7 terms do we actually know? We don't know any of them. So what do scientists do? Well, we evaluate what the likely values are. They see if you're a scientist, you can do that. But if you're not a scientist, like most of you in the room, you're just making it up. Do you see the difference there? All right, there's a big difference, isn't there? All right, we'll make sure you understand the difference. So the estimates, of course, vary widely. Evolutionists tend to have very optimistic estimates. I can understand why. I tend to be very pessimistic. I think you can understand why. Now, I said we don't know any of them. Actually, we know a little bit about them now. For instance, F sub E and N sub E, we have some measurements dealing with those. We know, for instance, that F sub P is not zero. We discovered 4,000 planets around other stars, so obviously F sub P is not zero. It may not be 1, but it's pretty high, actually, it turns out. So planets are pretty common, it would seem. But what about N sub E? Well, out of those 4,000, how many Earth-like have we found? I already mentioned that, haven't I? The answer is 0. And let me point out here something. If any of the 7 terms, it doesn't matter which one, if any of the 7 terms are 0, then it doesn't matter what the other 6 are at all, do they? All right, so all I have to do is demonstrate that one of them is 0, and we're done, okay? Now, I have here 3,500. That's kind of conservative. We're closer to 4,000. And so if I assume that gives us F sub P, of course, a little bit, but none are conducive for life. Now, if I throw the Earth into the mix, N sub E is equal to 0.0003. That is if we include the Earth. But you know what? We really ought not to include the Earth because that's not the question. Does the Earth exist? We know that. The question is, do any other planets like the Earth out there exist? And if we throw out the Earth, then from the data we get the conclusion that N is E is equal to 0. And again, we ought to eliminate the Earth as a control. So therefore, my conclusion, based upon science, by the way, is N is equal to 0. So in answer to the question, are we alone in the universe? The answer is, from the scientific data, yes. We are alone. Now, I bet most of you have never heard a scientist say that, have you? Anybody heard anybody say that? They never do. Now, if I bring this up with some fellow astronomers, I know what they say. In fact, they have said this to me. Well, not all the data are in. You know, one of my first papers I published 40 years ago, I was kind of new to this in astronomy. I was in grad school, just started really. And I wrote a little paper, and I just really had some tantalizing things, but I couldn't really reach what I wanted to go for. And I said, well, I even wrote in there, we need more data. Yeah. I thought that was so original and so clever. Now I realize it's so trite and overworked. Everybody says that. It's used all the time in science. Yet it never stopped anybody from making that conclusion before, right? So why the paralysis to make a conclusion in this? Every day, scientists reach conclusions based on far less data. And all of a sudden they come here, they got 4,000 data points. No, we can't reach a conclusion. It's not enough information yet. No, that's not it. The problem is the conclusion is going to take them somewhere where they don't want to go. Because if the Earth is unique, then that drags you back to creation, doesn't it? And if we're created, then suddenly you have to start asking some bigger questions that have nothing to do with science, like, well, maybe that Creator has some expectations on our lives. See, I decided a long time ago, just like with evolution and creation, the problem is not in the head, the problem is in the heart. You get the heart right, the head comes along pretty quickly after that. It's amazing how that works, isn't it? You can't do one without the other, unfortunately, so you have to kind of work your way sideways half the time on that. But scientifically, yes, they may say, well, you know, next week or next month or next year, we might get data that contradict that conclusion. I say, fine, come back next week, next month, or next year, and we'll talk. But again, why the paralysis? People are changing their minds all the time in science based upon new data. Why are you so afraid to make a conclusion here? And the answer, again, I've just given it to you. By the way, biblically, I've already argued here that the answer to the question is, yes, we are alone in the universe. Don't you love it when the science agrees with the Bible? Notice I didn't say it the other way around, that when the Bible agrees with science. That's getting it cart before the horse on that, because the Bible comes first, doesn't it? Now, does this preclude animal life, plant life, and microorganisms? At least my argument from Scripture. It's going to preclude it from the science, but from the Scripture, could I preclude animal life and plant life and microorganisms on other planets? And scripturally, no, I can't. But I could take a stab at it a couple of ways. One is that we have dominion here, according to Genesis 1 through 3, and also according to Psalm 8. We're in charge. We're in charge. It's an awesome responsibility. We are to actually preserve and protect what we have here, but also use it. I don't like the term environmentalism. I like the term conservation. That was something I learned in the 60s, and I think it's a good term, and I've been conserving for a long time. I was recycling stuff almost 60 years ago, long before it was cool. Never made any sense in the 60s to use once and throw away. Remember that mentality? They've gotten away from that now, but I've been recycling my entire life, so don't tell me about recycling. And I think we should treat resources well. You know, we've got plenty of trees. We can cut them down and grow them back. They do grow back, you know. And I also believe in humane treatment of animals. I am a member of PETA, people eating tasty animals, particularly when it comes to pigs. I love pork. Oh, yeah. All right, so we are allowed to use these things, but we're also to be in charge of them. Sometimes people want to preserve and forget about the use, and some people want to use and they forget about the preserve, and it's both, folks. I could give a talk on that, couldn't I? But I digress. But anyway, we are in charge. God has put us in charge. But yet if nobody like us exists on these planets populated by all sorts of animals, nobody's in charge. That's not the way God works. There's a purpose to all these things. Again, the purpose is for us. That's what the animals and plants are all about. They serve us, folks. And a little side here, I won't go anywhere with this, but it's interesting that biblically plants are not really alive. They're never spoken as being born or dying. They wither and they fade, but they aren't alive in the sense that we are. Now, scientifically they are, but biblically they're in a different category. By the way, there are two requirements found in Scripture for life. One of them given in the book of Leviticus, the life is in the blood. If you don't have blood, you ain't alive, according to that definition. And also at the time of the flood, it talked about wiping out all the things that have the breath of life in their nostrils. So that's a secondary approach to this. So microorganisms don't have blood, so they're not biblically alive. I won't argue they're scientifically alive, but they're not alive in the same sense that things with blood and breath are. Okay, finally I'll wrap up with this. Some people have argued that there's a spiritual battle going on here, and they make it I won't deny that to a certain point, but they do, I think, maybe go a little too far in this, a little heavy-handed in it. They argue that Satan sometimes appears as an angel of light, according to 2 Corinthians 11:14. And they also point out that many of the UFO sightings are lights in the sky. Ergo, these must be demons or representations of demons moving around in the sky. I beg to differ on that. I think it's being just a little too heavy-handed, a little too obvious about all of this. If demons wish to, by the way, they connect with demonic activity. If people, and they connect it with eschatology, certain eschatological understandings as well, and an occult connection. But you know what? If demons or Satan really wanted to trip people up in this way, would he have to actually have physical manifestations in the sky? All he has to do is plant in their minds this thinking. And that's the thinking of many of these people. They may have never seen any things, but they believe in them earnestly because they want to believe in them. I've seen interviews with some women who claim to have eggs harvested, and they've got space babies all over the world, and they can't really recount, you know, how it happened. They just simply know that it happened. These could be dreams, I don't know, but it doesn't have to be any kind of spaceship-like things taken away. So they can simply dream these things. It doesn't have to be lights in the sky doing this. However, there is a spiritual connection, I think, and that's the reinforcement of belief in evolution. You go out there and you talk to people who earnestly and strongly believe in life elsewhere and that we may have been visited a lot, you will find most of them believe in evolution. It's a way out for them. Very few creationists believe in the flying saucer phenomenon. They don't believe that we're being visited. And so as long as you get people thinking there's life elsewhere, then it detracts you from the issues at hand here. Did God make us on this planet? Of course he didn't, if life exists elsewhere, so therefore there is no God. They may not be atheists, but they may as well be in many cases. And I think that's the real wicked agenda that's here, the spiritual agenda behind all of this, and it does deflect our attention from the true and living God, which is sought to be our motivation in all that we do. Now, if you want to learn more about this stuff, we do have a little pocket guide out there. I think they're discounted when you come to the museum, but I wrote this several years ago, a pocket guide on UFOs and ETs. It contains a lot of the information I shared today, plus a lot more beyond that. And of course, they have this planetarium show they advertised before you came in, Aliens, Fact or Fiction. I wrote that, and we premiered that a few years ago. I will warn you, if you haven't seen it yet, there's a very creepy ending, the last 20 seconds or so. You've been warned. I thank you for your attention today, and we've got an announcement here before we close.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Faulkner.